Hey everybody, and welcome to this crash course video. Before we go into it, as you probably already know, I mentioned it on Sunday and made a quick YouTube community post, whatever that is, about it. On Thursday there will be a ladder reset, a ranked leaderboard reset. So I also plan on streaming in the evening of that day, assuming the reset goes through, just as an information. And the second thing is, today's crash course is gonna be a bit different because this Commonwealth episode is actually gonna be about a team deck, because I can't recommend playing this in the 1 versus 1. If you want to play this in a 1 versus 1, the deck would not look too different. The main difference would probably be the ASF setup and the tank tab. Infantry tab, support tab, recon tab is gonna look more or less the same. I guess at some point I should make a short video just the general biggest differences these days between team and 1 versus 1 stack, 1 versus 1 decks. They're really not that different. But let's just get into it. Logistics is really not that horrible. For team deck, you're more than... This is enough, infantry CV, tank CV, that is perfectly fine. Supply truck, fob. In a 1 versus 1, you obviously want more CVs, With cheap CV, if you want to use cheap CVs, or, you take 2 4 per card, or you even take 3 cards of CVs. Infantry tab, I'm not a huge fan of them, especially in 1 versus 1 SAS. That is just not very card efficient, not comparable like, let's say, LSTR or something, because they don't feel like a big gap like a heavy AT or something. Not particularly amazing against infantry or helicopters, but they're still useful to have, and in team games they're perfectly fine to use. Next up, I go for Highlanders 90. Obviously worse than Legion, but actually balanced. They're still good though. Eric's on 10-man squads is always good. Commandos 90, obviously you can't skip. Amazing infantry. In the ASLF, because the ASLF is a good transport, and in team games you can get away with generally stuff being a bit more expensive. So the 5-point difference is not... It's in general not a huge deal on like 20-point shock squads, wheeled versus drag transport, the 5 points. But in team games it's even less noticeable. And next up I actually go for a card of Canadian rifles in their 5-pointer. It's really not great spam infantry, 1 armor, and the Canadian rifles themselves are not amazing. I go for the base ones instead of the 85 ones because you get more per card, and I don't find the extra law really worth it, because the main purpose is to fill towns and forests and just shield with their meat. It's really all there is to it. And ATGM wise, I run a card of Milan 2. Milan ones are of course fine, but in team games I prefer the bigger punch through, because chances that you get some nasty side shots or something are just generally lower, because it's a lot more front versus front and a bit less flanking than it is in 1 versus 1. Canadian Airborne 90 are also like good infantry that you can use. You can of course run the TH495. Of course Fusilier 90s they're good. They're not amazing, but if you want like pure AT infantry, that's fine. Some people like the Warrior Milan. It's probably the only good warrior. Gurkhas 90 can be okay. Paratroopers 90 are okay. I wouldn't recommend Royal Marines 90. If you want reservists, you have reservists, but once again, just a normal 5-pointer. So nothing special there. Support tab. There's some good stuff in there. You have the Truck Rapier, which is a very solid, essentially pure anti-plane piece, but it also means it's pretty cheap for its anti-plane capabilities, good range, good accuracy. You can fire all 8 after another without having to reload. 5 HE is not amazing. You're gonna struggle against 25 Ts and A10s, but other than that, it's a really good piece. It's slow, but the fact that you don't really keep it as close to the front line as you might do with like a Roland or something means that it is also not that hard to keep it alive, actually. Just have to keep in mind that your opponent might try to counter battery, so maybe try to keep it near a forest or something, at road or something. You can also park it in a leg if you want. Stormer, one of the best AA pieces in the game. Just don't use it against ground vehicles. Park it somewhere where it doesn't have line of sight on the ground, but its anti-plane and helicopter capabilities, amazing accuracy, good range. 6 HG, which is nice. And only has to reload after 8 missiles and carries a lot of them. It's a really good AA unit. And then lastly, I use the Wolverine to fill my gap with some cheap and real stuff. It's not mandatory. I really like it, especially in 1 versus 1s. In team games, you don't really need it. In team games, you're probably fine with this. There's a good chance, especially if you're coordinated, that your team can cover for some cheap stuff in the opening or for the flanks or base defense. But they're still good. Artillery-wise, you can run M110A2. In team games, I like the Ace 90. Not a huge fan of it in 1 versus 1s, but in team games, it's fine. You really get a lot more value out of it once you have 2 on the field. You might say, duh, of course, you know, but the fact that it has a short burst length of only 3 shots, although the 3 shots are a very high rate of fire, means that a single one very rarely can finish off stuff. And then it gives your opponent a lot of time to then move the target out of the way before the next salvo comes, which is why you really want 2 most of the time. Unless you just want to do some damage, but if you actually want to kill stuff, yeah. You can run the ADATs, of course. It's a fun little unit. It's just an ATGM playing magnet and stuff, so it requires a lot of management. If you like that, or if you just want to mess around, sure, go for it. I wouldn't really use it, most of the time. But it is a good unit, but it's also relatively easy to kill. Yeah, and of course a mortar. Run this mortar because it has more ammo than the other 3 HE mortars, and you don't get 4 or 5 HE mortar in this deck anyway. For team games, of course, the tank deck is gonna look a lot heavier. Here I run a Jelly 2 and 2 cards of 1 Mark 3s. The 1 Mark 3 is actually a good Jelly 1. The other 2 Jelly 1s are not particularly amazing. And Jelly 2 is, of course, for team games, possibly the best super heavy in the game because you get 3 per card and it's the most survivable one outside of the speed. And then the maxes, to fill like a cheaper gap, and it's just one of the best medium tanks in the game as well. Recon tab, not a lot of good stuff to choose from. Normally I would run Recon Helos, but once again, in team games I will rely on my teammates for this. Just running kind of Lynx with the SBS, or rather SBS with Lynx and a Saxon. And the Aslav. Next up, Vehicle tab. Oh yeah, hello, before we go on. You can of course Recce if you like 2-man squads. I think 2-man squads are underrated. I mentioned it when talking about the Fanspare in the team, in a tier list. Ferret can be fun, but it's incredibly inconsistent. This one can be fun, but I wouldn't recommend it for team games. The SF is really just, for cheap optics in the opening, and if for some reason the enemy leaves the gap in a certain, position, flank or something, you can just sneak through. That's all really it is to it. In team games, the most important recon is going to be infantry. Vehicles are not as impactful as they would be in 1 versus 1s. And as of course we talk about AMAX 10s and the like. You could, if you want something purely for town grinding, like a town grinding infantry squad, Pathfinders can work, but you just don't need them because you have Commandos 90. Vehicle tab, Chimera is going to be fun, but I don't think it's particularly useful outside of 1 versus 1s, or if you're playing Canada. You're just better off with getting more expensive Challenger 1 Mark 3s. No turret, no stabilizer, no optics, slow. It's really not that horrible, in all honesty. It's just there's no place because you have the Challengers. You can run the AVRE. I only run the Vickers because I don't have space for another vehicle, but AVRE is still solid. Iltis Tattoo is actually not that horrible. Aslav Tattoo is also not that horrible. No, they're all worthwhile units. Not amazing, but usable. Helicopter tab, you can run the Lynx 3. I actually don't have space for another helicopter because I want 5 plane cards. Lynx 3 in team games is probably the main thing you want. In 1 versus 1s, you can also run the Tau 2 or the 20mm, just have like some sort of cheap helicopter that has some sort of weaponry. Not that bad, actually. The gunship with the heat rockets is kind of fun. Every single rocket will actually deal at least 1 damage, but it's more of a novelty than an actually useful unit. And plane tab for team games. I do run 2 cards of the Eurofighter. Up with it, of course. You can also run like 1 of the Eurofighter and then Tornado or the Hornet. Or just go with 1 card of ASF if you want to rely more on your teammates or on your AA. That's completely up to you. I like to have a good amount of ASFs in team games. Or, good amount of value in terms of ASFs in my team games. Run, of course, the Kehu. It's a very solid AT. It's essentially the Gallop, but balanced. F111C obviously can't skip the best bomber in the game. And then seat plane wise, I run the Electric Voodoo down-vetted actually. It's gonna be inconsistent, but like it's cheap and has 50% ECM. Having only 1 on veteran is just not quite. It also like doesn't have a lot of range, so yeah. You can of course in theory run the Harrier, but it doesn't have stealth. So it's gonna be a lot less. It's gonna be, in my eyes, weaker than the Voodoo against stronger opponents, because they're probably gonna pay more attention to the Sea Harrier being a seed plane and immediately spotting it. But yeah. Otherwise, you know, for 1 versus 1s, the Starfighter can be okay. Freedom Fighter can be fun, you know, you get a lot of them, and for 70 points, amazing payload. It's just that it's not particularly fast and has no ECM, but can be a fun little plane if you manage to get rid of the enemy AA net, and you can just keep them coming. Especially in Canada, National can be a bit fun. Hornet is an acceptable cluster bomber. It's not amazing, but it's usable. It has good short-range missiles and good survivability, so there's that, but wouldn't necessarily recommend it. Hornet is a good ASF, you know, 2 veteran. GR7 can still be good, even though, you know, with the laser guided bomb nerfs, especially the low HE bombs got hit a lot more. But it's honestly still a decent plane. Especially the fact that you can split them up and like stun and damage multiple different stuff units. You know, if there's a convoy or something, it's really useful for that. Obviously not comparable to Kurnos, but still a decent plane. GR3 also a decent plane, you know, rocket pod and helo hunter at once, because helo hunting is sometimes, like single helicopter sneaking around or something, is something Commonwealth is really bad at dealing with. GR1 is an amazing plane in a 1 versus 1s, absolutely. It's actually kind of ridiculous how good it is. It's like a Hawk 51 but with clusters. And team games not as great, but you can of course still use it. It's not unusable or something. GR1A if you want like a really cheap but high AT, a high AP AT plane. So for semi-active, so not the most consistent one, but you get it on Elite, 2 on Elite, so it's not horrible. If you want a pure helo hunter, the Sea Harrier can work, but I think if you go for this, you might as well go for, you know, rocket pod 1. You only get 2 upweighted versus 3, but I think it's still more value, at least in 1 versus 1s. And of course the 2 tornadoes here are also fine ASFs. And it's GR1. I tried this before, but I'm not a huge fan of it. I think if you want like one of the cluster planes, I think the Hornet is a better choice. And that's Commonwealth for team games. In team games, I forgot to mention, I forgot about this. In team games, the cluster MLRs is also perfectly fine, by the way. In 1 versus 1s, I saw Putin use it, but I wouldn't recommend it. I think in 1 versus 1s, I would actually go for the M110. But yeah, this is Commonwealth. In team games, it is a solid deck. It is a decent deck in team games. On most maps. I guess there's some maps, like especially if you're playing on a big map compared for 2 versus 2, where flanking is actually happening. For example, I like playing 2 versus 2 on Snakebit or Crossroads, even though they're supposed to be a 3 versus 3 map. I think they work really well for 2 versus 2. Then you're gonna have trouble. If it's really just mostly head-on fights, like saying playing 3v3s on 2v2 battlefield, you're gonna do pretty well, I'd say. So yeah, that's Commonwealth. Play it in team games, but do not do it in 1 versus 1s, please. Don't do it to yourself. You're better than that. And yeah, that's Commonwealth Crash Course. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something, and I'll hopefully see you next time. See ya.